The overseer's whip cracked like thunder at 4:37 a.m., but this time, nobody screamed. This is the story of how enslaved people in Southampton County turned their chains into weapons and rewrote history in blood. The humid Virginia air hung thick with tobacco smoke and magnolia blossoms, while beneath the floorboards of the Turner Plantation house, something else lurked, the metallic scent of freshly sharpened steel. Nat Turner stood in the doorway of his cabin, calloused fingers tracing the handle of a hatchet hidden beneath rough burlap. The wooden floor creaked under his bare feet, worn smooth by decades of shuffling compliance that was about to end forever. August 21st, 1831. The date would carve itself into American memory like a brand into flesh. Turner had been planning this moment for months, gathering followers through whispered conversations in tobacco fields and coded messages delivered through Sunday hymns. His rebellion would begin at the Travis Plantation, where he'd lived since childhood, watching white children grow fat on food prepared by hands they considered property. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd learned to read using the same Bible his masters quoted to justify his bondage. Before we dive deeper into this night that changed everything, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe, because what happened next has been deliberately erased from most textbooks. The rebellion began with surgical precision. Turner and 6 conspirators crept through pre-dawn darkness toward the Travis house, where the family slept peacefully under quilts, stitched by the same hands now gripping axes. The front door stood unlocked. Who expected danger from their own property? Joseph Travis, his wife Sally, and their infant son would be the first to discover that human beings pushed beyond endurance don't remain human for long. The killing started at 5:15 a.m. No screams pierced the Virginia morning because Turner's group had learned efficiency from years of watching hogs slaughtered. Quick, silent, decisive. Within minutes, the Travis family lay still in beds they'd never leave, while their former slaves ransacked the house for weapons and horses. But Turner's vision extended far beyond single-family revenge. This was systematic warfare designed to strike terror into every white household across Southampton County. From the Travis Plantation, the growing band of rebels moved like wildfire through the countryside, their numbers swelling with each farm they reached. Field hands joined readily, but house slaves faced an agonizing choice to remain loyal to families who owned them, or risk everything for freedom that might end in death. The rebellion's early success hinged on speed and surprise. Most white families never saw their killers coming. Rebels would appear at dawn, emerging from tobacco rows like avenging spirits, faces painted with ash and blood, voices raised in freedom songs that sounded like war cries. They moved in coordinated groups, hitting multiple plantations simultaneously, leaving no survivors to warn neighboring farms. By noon, Turner commanded nearly 70 followers, armed with everything from stolen muskets to farm tools transformed into weapons of liberation. They'd killed 55 white people and covered 20 miles of Virginia countryside, leaving a trail of burning plantation houses smoking like funeral pyres against the August sky. Blood soaked the soil. The rebels reached their tactical peak at the Barrow Plantation, where they encountered their first serious resistance. James Barrow had received word of the uprising and barricaded his family inside their brick house while sending riders to alert the county militia. For the first time that day, Turner's forces faced organized opposition rather than sleeping victims. What happened at the Barrow Plantation would determine whether this slave rebellion became a regional revolution or died in Virginia dirt. The white community's response was swift, and brutal militia companies formed within hours, supported by federal troops dispatched from Norfolk. But Turner had anticipated this reaction, and his next move would test whether terrorized white families would stand together or turn on each other in panic. The real horror was just beginning, because Turner understood something. his enemies didn't fear spreads faster than fire. And by nightfall, white Southampton County would be consuming itself from within. The church bells of Jerusalem, Virginia, rang 13 times at 1 p.m. But they weren't calling people to prayer. The entire white population of Southampton County was fleeing in panic as news of Turner's rebellion spread faster than wildfire through dry timber. Margaret Whitehead clutched her infant daughter against her chest as she ran barefoot through cornfields, her silk dress torn by thorns and soaked with perspiration. Behind her, the Whitehead plantation burned like a torch against the August sky, smoke columns visible for 20 miles in every direction. The sound of galloping horses echoed through the countryside, but nobody knew whether those riders brought salvation or death. The rebellion had shattered every assumption white Virginians held about their peculiar institution. Trusted house slaves who'd served breakfast that morning were now hunting their former masters with stolen muskets. Field hands, who'd seemed docile and grateful, had revealed themselves as calculating revolutionaries. The comfortable fiction that enslaved people were content with bondage died harder than the people who believed it. Turner's tactical genius lay in understanding white psychology as clearly as he knew scripture. Each plantation his forces struck sent refugees streaming toward Jerusalem, the county seat, carrying wild stories that grew more terrifying with each retelling. Some claimed hundreds of rebels marched behind Turner. Others swore they'd seen enslaved people armed with cannons stolen from the militia armory. Truth and terror blended until white Southampton County couldn't distinguish between facts and nightmares. The panic reached Jerusalem by 2:30 p.m. Town officials barricaded the courthouse, while families crowded into the strongest buildings, creating refugee camps inside their own community. Women who'd never touched firearms learned to load muskets, while their husbands rode out with hastily formed militias. Children huddled in corners, listening to adults whisper about throat-cutting rebels who moved like ghosts through familiar landscapes, transformed into hunting grounds. What made Turner's rebellion particularly terrifying was its surgical precision. Unlike previous slave uprisings that devolved into chaotic violence, Turner's forces followed military discipline. They struck specific targets for maximum psychological impact: wealthy planters who represented the system's power structure. Poor white families received warnings to flee rather than face slaughter. This calculated mercy spread as much fear as brutality because it proved enslaved people could think strategically about liberation. From the diary of militia captain James Trezevant, August 21, 1831, the Negroes move with purpose unknown in previous rebellions. They spare some, kill others, following logic we cannot decipher. This suggests planning beyond our worst fears. The rebellion's success created its own destruction. By mid-afternoon, Turner commanded nearly 80 followers, but managing such numbers required coordination his leadership structure couldn't sustain. Different groups began acting independently, some maintaining discipline, while others devolved into revenge-driven killing sprees. The unified force that had terrorized Southampton County started fracturing under the weight of its own momentum. Meanwhile, white reinforcements poured into the region. Virginia Governor John Floyd dispatched 3 companies of artillery from Norfolk. Federal troops marched south from Petersburg. Local militias mobilized across 5 counties, transforming southeastern Virginia into an armed camp where terrified white men shot at shadows and questioned every black face they encountered. Justice became vengeance overnight. The real carnage began when panicked white militias started killing enslaved people who had nothing to do with Turner's rebellion. Suspected conspirators faced execution without trial. Innocent field hands died for looking defiant or running when approached by armed patrols. The line between suppressing rebellion and committing massacre disappeared in tobacco smoke and blood-soaked soil. Turner recognized his window closing. By evening, hundreds of white soldiers surrounded the rebels, forcing them into smaller groups that could be hunted systematically. The rebellion that had seemed unstoppable at dawn was fragmenting into desperate survival attempts by nightfall. But Turner had one final card to play, a strategy so audacious it would either ensure his legacy or guarantee his destruction. The preacher warrior was about to vanish into the very landscape that had shaped him, beginning a manhunt that would expose the brutal mathematics of American slavery. Turner's hatchet dripped crimson as he crouched behind a fallen oak at 9 p.m., listening to bloodhounds bay in the distance. The rebellion that had terrorized Southampton County for 16 hours was collapsing, but the preacher warrior had vanished into swampland he'd known since childhood, beginning America's most infamous manhunt. The Great Dismal Swamp stretched for miles in every direction, a maze of cypress trees, black water, and quicksand that had swallowed runaway slaves for generations. Turner understood this landscape intimately, having preached to marooned communities hidden in its depths. What his pursuers saw as impenetrable wilderness, he navigated like a familiar neighborhood. The swamp would either save him or become his tomb. Behind him, Southampton County burned, not from rebel torches anymore, but from white vengeance that had spiraled beyond all control. Militia companies roamed the countryside, executing any enslaved person who couldn't prove their whereabouts during the rebellion. Bodies swung from oak trees like grotesque fruit, while plantation houses became fortresses surrounded by armed guards who shot first and asked questions never. The manhunt mobilized resources unprecedented in American history. Governor Floyd posted a $1,000 reward for Turner's capture, more money than most Virginians saw in a lifetime. Federal troops joined local militias in systematic sweeps through every swamp, cave, and abandoned cabin in 5 counties. Bloodhounds imported from Georgia followed scent trails that led deeper into wilderness, where maps showed nothing but blank space, marked impassable. But Turner had advantages beyond geographical knowledge. The rebellion had created a network of sympathizers who supplied food, information, and shelter, despite knowing the penalty for helping him was death. Enslaved people across the region understood that Turner's survival represented something larger than one man's freedom. It proved that rebellion was possible, that white power wasn't absolute, that the peculiar institution could bleed. Turner survived by becoming a ghost. He moved only at night, slept in hollow logs or caves, ate roots and berries, supplemented by food left at predetermined locations by supporters. During daylight hours, he remained motionless while search parties passed within yards of his hiding places. The skills that had made him an effective preacher, patience, observation, understanding human nature, now served his survival. From Virginia militia records, September 2nd, 1831, search parties report strange phenomena in swamp regions, compass needles spinning without cause, sounds of preaching where no preacher stands. Local Negroes claim Turner speaks with spirits of the dead. The psychological warfare worked both ways. Turner's continued freedom tormented white Southampton County, proving their military superiority meant nothing against an enemy who refused conventional combat. Every night brought fresh rumors: Turner seen near Jerusalem, Turner gathering new followers, Turner planning another uprising. Fear poisoned daily life as thoroughly as his rebellion had poisoned the illusion of racial harmony. Meanwhile, the legal machinery of slavery ground forward with mechanical brutality. Captured rebels faced trials that were formalities preceding executions. Enslaved people who had never left their plantations during the rebellion died for looking suspicious or failing to demonstrate sufficient grief over dead masters. The line between justice and terrorism disappeared entirely. White families who had fled during the rebellion returned to find their world fundamentally changed. Trusted house slaves who had remained loyal during the uprising still faced suspicion and punishment. The comfortable relationships between masters and supposedly content servants revealed themselves as performances maintained through force rather than affection. Every shared meal, every casual conversation, every moment of apparent harmony was re-examined for signs of hidden rebellion. 6 weeks passed without capture. Turner's ability to evade the largest manhunt in American history elevated him from rebel leader to mythical figure. Enslaved people across the South whispered stories about the preacher who had struck down his oppressors and vanished into wilderness, like Moses leading his people through the desert. These stories spread through underground networks, inspiring both hope and fear among those still in bondage. The manhunt's failure exposed the fundamental weakness of the slavery system. It depended entirely on the cooperation of its victims. When enslaved people withdrew that cooperation, the entire structure became vulnerable. Turner's survival proved that determined resistance could successfully challenge white authority, a lesson that terrified slaveholders across the region. But even ghosts eventually cast shadows, and Turner's long campaign of survival was approaching its final chapter in a confrontation that would determine whether his rebellion died with him or lived on in the nightmares of his enemies. Benjamin Phipps raised his musket at 10:47 a.m. on October 30th, 1831, but hesitated when he recognized the gaunt figure drinking from Cabin Pond. 68 days of manhunting had led to this moment face to face with America's most wanted fugitive, who looked more like a scarecrow than the devil white Virginia had imagined. Turner's capture came not through military brilliance, but through the simple mathematics of survival. Even ghosts must eat, and hunger had driven him from the deepest swamp refuges toward populated areas where food could be found. The rebellion's architect had been reduced to scavenging scraps from abandoned cabins and begging sustenance from enslaved people who risked their lives to help him. Phipps, a poor white farmer who had never owned slaves, faced a terrible choice. The $1,000 reward represented more wealth than his family would see in decades of scratching subsistence from worn-out soil. But Turner had become something larger than money, a symbol whose capture or continued freedom would determine how this chapter of American history ended. Standing in morning mist beside that pond, Phipps held the power to close or extend a story that had terrorized the South for over 2 months. The confrontation lasted less than 5 minutes. Turner, weakened by starvation and exposure, offered no resistance when Phipps approached with loaded weapon. Perhaps the preacher warrior understood that his rebellion's true victory lay not in personal survival, but in the fear it had planted in white minds across the region. Perhaps he was simply too exhausted to run anymore. The man who had commanded 80 followers and struck terror into 5 counties surrendered to a single farmer without firing a shot. Turner's capture triggered celebrations that revealed as much about white psychology as his rebellion had exposed about the slavery system. Church bells rang across Southampton County, while militias fired victory salutes into autumn air, thick with wood smoke and relief. Families who had spent weeks barricaded in their homes emerged blinking into sunlight, finally believing the nightmare was over. But the celebrations masked deeper anxieties that Turner's long freedom had created. His ability to evade capture for over 2 months had demonstrated that determined resistance could successfully challenge white authority. Even defeated, he represented proof that the peculiar institution's victims could think, plan, and fight back with devastating effectiveness. From the Norfolk Herald, November 1st, 1831, Turner's capture brings relief to our troubled region. Yet questions remain about how one Negro evaded our finest military minds for 10 weeks. What other conspiracies simmer undetected in our midst? Turner's journey from Cabin Pond to the Jerusalem jail became a perverse victory parade. Crowds lined the route to stare at the man whose name had become synonymous with white nightmares. Some expected to see a monster. Instead, they found a thin, middle-aged preacher who spoke calmly about divine visions and God's judgment on slaveholders. This disconnect between reputation and reality made Turner more unsettling. Not less evil was supposed to look evil, not wear the face of ordinary humanity. The jail in Jerusalem had been reinforced during Turner's flight. Its walls thickened, and guards tripled to prevent rescue attempts that never materialized. Turner's supporters had melted back into the enslaved population, their brief moment of open rebellion replaced by the familiar performance of docility that survival required. But their silence didn't indicate loyalty. It showed the careful calculation that had always defined resistance under slavery. Turner's capture coincided with the arrival of Thomas Ruffin Gray, a lawyer and plantation owner who saw opportunity in the rebellion's aftermath. Gray secured exclusive access to the prisoner, ostensibly to conduct legal interviews, but actually to produce a sensational account of the rebellion that would make him wealthy. What emerged from their conversations would shape how Americans remembered Turner's rebellion for generations. The condemned man understood he was participating in his own mythology. Gray's questions probed for supernatural explanations, divine visions, prophetic dreams, religious mania that would allow white audiences to dismiss the rebellion as the work of a deranged fanatic rather than a rational response to systematic oppression. Turner played along, recognizing that legend might accomplish what warfare couldn't. 10 days remained until execution, but Turner's most dangerous weapon wasn't the hatchet that had started his rebellion or the charisma that had gathered followers. It was his voice, and the story he was about to tell would echo through American history long after his body hung lifeless from a Virginia gibbet. The preacher's final sermon was about to begin, delivered not from a pulpit but from a death cell to an audience that would carry his words far beyond Southampton County's blood-soaked borders. Gray's quill scratched against parchment in the flickering candlelight of Turner's cell, recording words that would either damn or sanctify the rebellion's architect. The lawyer had come expecting to document the ravings of a madman. Instead, he found himself transcribing the testimony of a theologian who spoke about divine justice with the precision of a biblical scholar. Turner understood the power of narrative better than his captors realized, and he was crafting his own legend with every carefully chosen word. When Gray asked about his motivations, Turner didn't speak of revenge or hatred. He described heavenly visions, prophetic dreams, and God's commandment to strike down the enemies of his people. This wasn't the confession of a defeated rebel. It was the final sermon of a preacher who had found his ultimate pulpit. The strategy was brilliant in its simplicity. White audiences could dismiss political rebellion as criminal conspiracy, but they couldn't ignore claims of divine inspiration without questioning their own religious foundations. Turner positioned himself not as an enemy of Christianity, but as its truest servant, following biblical precedents that every Sunday school child knew by heart. Moses had killed an Egyptian overseer. Joshua had slaughtered entire cities. David had built God's kingdom through warfare that made Turner's rebellion look restrained. "I was ordained for some great purpose in the hands of the Almighty," Turner told Gray, his voice carrying the same authority that had once mesmerized congregations. Several years rolled round, in which many events occurred to strengthen me in this my belief. Every word was calculated to unsettle white Christians, who found themselves unable to refute Turner's theological arguments without undermining their own faith. Gray's interviews revealed the systematic planning behind what white Virginia had dismissed as spontaneous violence. Turner had spent years studying his enemy's weaknesses, identifying potential allies, and timing his rebellion to maximize psychological impact. The August date hadn't been chosen randomly. It coincided with harvest season, when enslaved people moved freely between plantations and plantation owners relaxed security protocols. The confession also exposed the network of supporters who had enabled Turner's rebellion and his subsequent escape. Names emerged of trusted house slaves who had passed information, field hands who had supplied weapons, and even some white sympathizers who had provided indirect assistance. This revelation sent fresh waves of paranoia through Southampton County, as residents realized the conspiracy had extended far beyond the rebels who had wielded axes and muskets. From Thomas Gray's published confession, November 11, 1831, Turner's intelligence surprised all who encountered him. His ability to read and write, combined with knowledge of Scripture, created a dangerous combination of learning and fanaticism previously unknown among the Negro population. Turner's execution was scheduled for November 11th, a date chosen to allow maximum publicity for Gray's confession, which would be published immediately afterward. The lawyer had already sold advance copies to newspapers across the South, ensuring that Turner's words would spread faster than his rebellion ever had. What Gray didn't anticipate was how those words would be interpreted by audiences he hadn't considered. Northern abolitionists seized on Turner's confession as proof that slavery corrupted both oppressor and oppressed, creating conditions where violence became inevitable. They published excerpts alongside commentary that portrayed Turner as a tragic hero driven to desperate measures by an inhuman system. Southern readers found themselves unable to dismiss these arguments without abandoning the religious language they used to justify their peculiar institution. The confession's most dangerous element wasn't Turner's description of the rebellion itself, but his calm certainty that more uprisings would follow. He spoke of signs and portents that suggested God's judgment on America was just beginning. Solar eclipses, unusual weather patterns, and unexplained atmospheric phenomena all indicated divine displeasure with a nation that profited from human bondage. These weren't the desperate threats of a condemned man. They sounded like prophecies delivered with absolute conviction. Turner's final days in jail became a pilgrimage site for curious visitors who came expecting to see a monster and left disturbed by his apparent sanity. The preacher warrior remained calm, articulate, and unrepentant, expressing no regret for the violence he had unleashed. When asked if he felt remorse for killing innocent women and children, Turner replied that slavery had killed far more innocents over far longer periods. Death stalked Southampton County. The execution preparations revealed wide anxiety about Turner's continued influence even in death. Authorities planned to burn his body and scatter the ashes to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine. But they couldn't burn the words he had spoken to Gray, and those words were already spreading through networks that would carry them far beyond Virginia's borders. Turner's rebellion had ended, but his war against slavery was entering its most dangerous phase. The battle for memory and meaning that would determine how Americans understood both the uprising and the system it had challenged. The rope hung motionless in November air as Turner climbed 13 steps to the scaffold at 11 a.m., his chains clanking against wooden planks worn smooth by condemned men's final footsteps. 3,000 spectators had gathered in Jerusalem to witness the execution that would either end a nightmare or transform a rebel into a martyr whose influence would outlast his flesh. Turner's composure unnerved the crowd that had come expecting to see fear, remorse, or at least acknowledgement of defeat. Instead, the preacher warrior stood calmly while the executioner adjusted the noose, his eyes scanning faces in the crowd with the same intensity he had once brought to reading scripture. Some witnesses later claimed he smiled. Others insisted they saw divine light emanating from his features. What everyone agreed upon was his absolute lack of terror in the face of death. The sheriff read the death warrant in a voice that carried across the packed town square, listing crimes that had terrorized Southampton County for over 2 months. 55 white deaths. Destruction of property, inciting rebellion among the slave population, leading an armed insurrection against lawful authority. Each charge carried the weight of white Virginia's need for vengeance, but Turner received them like benedictions rather than condemnations. When offered a final opportunity to speak, Turner declined the traditional last words that might have provided comfort to his executioners. No confession of error, no plea for forgiveness from God or man, no warning to other enslaved people against following his example. His silence spoke louder than any speech could have, leaving white audiences to interpret his meaning while ensuring they could never claim his defeat. The execution itself lasted less than 10 minutes, but its psychological impact would reverberate for decades. Turner's body swayed in autumn wind, while spectators dispersed, carrying stories that would mutate with each retelling. Some claimed supernatural phenomena had accompanied his death. Unexplained darkness, strange sounds, birds falling from the sky. Others insisted his corpse had smiled even after breath departed. Truth and mythology merged in ways that served Turner's posthumous purposes better than any conventional victory could have achieved. From the Richmond Inquirer, November 15, 1831. Turner died without confession or apparent remorse. His composure disturbed witnesses who expected to see divine judgment manifest in his final moments. Instead, he seemed to embrace death as vindication rather than punishment. The aftermath of Turner's execution revealed the rebellion's true scope and lasting impact. Gray's confession had already sold thousands of copies across the South, spreading Turner's theological justifications for rebellion to audiences far beyond Virginia. Northern newspapers reprinted excerpts alongside editorial commentary that portrayed the uprising as an inevitable consequence of slavery's moral corruption. Legislative responses demonstrated white recognition that Turner's rebellion had fundamentally altered the political landscape. Virginia's General Assembly debated gradual emancipation for the first time in decades, with some delegates arguing that Turner had proven the impossibility of maintaining slavery without constant threat of violent resistance. These debates ultimately failed, but their mere occurrence showed how deeply the rebellion had shaken slaveholding confidence. More immediately, the execution triggered a wave of repressive legislation across the South, designed to prevent future Turner-style uprisings. New laws prohibited enslaved people from learning to read or write, attending religious gatherings without white supervision, or moving between plantations without written passes. The rebellion's success had forced the slavery system to reveal its dependence on ignorance and isolation to maintain control. Turner's body disappeared within hours of execution, but not through official channels. Despite authorities' plans to burn the corpse and scatter ashes, sympathizers had spirited away remains for secret burial in an unmarked grave whose location would never be revealed. This final act of defiance ensured that Turner's enemies could never desecrate his memory through posthumous humiliation. The psychological warfare continued beyond death. Unexplained fires began appearing at plantations across Southampton County, while tools and weapons disappeared from locked sheds. No evidence linked these incidents to organized conspiracy, but their timing suggested Turner's influence persisted among surviving supporters. White families who thought execution had ended their nightmare discovered that dead martyrs could be more dangerous than living rebels. Terror had learned new shapes. The rebellion's legacy manifested most clearly in changed relationships between masters and enslaved people throughout the region. The comfortable fiction of mutual affection had died with Turner's victims, replaced by open acknowledgement that slavery rested on force rather than consent. House slaves, who had once been trusted confidants, now faced constant suspicion. Field hands, who had seemed docile, revealed themselves capable of calculated resistance that stopped just short of open rebellion. But Turner's most enduring victory wasn't the fear he had planted in white minds. It was the hope he had kindled among enslaved people, who finally saw proof that their oppressors could be challenged, defeated, and killed by ordinary men with extraordinary determination. Smoke rose from burning slave quarters across South Carolina as news of Turner's execution reached Charleston 3 days later, but the flames weren't set by rebels. They were lit by white militias, destroying evidence of literacy schools that had operated in secret for decades. Turner's rebellion had exposed a hidden network of educated enslaved people that stretched far beyond Virginia's borders. The psychological shockwaves from Southampton County transformed slavery throughout the American South in ways Turner couldn't have anticipated when he first raised his hatchet. State after state passed increasingly draconian laws designed to prevent future uprisings, but these restrictions inadvertently revealed the system's fundamental weakness. It could only survive by keeping its victims ignorant, isolated, and afraid. Georgia banned enslaved people from assembling in groups larger than 7 without white supervision. South Carolina prohibited any person of color from working as a sailor or pilot, positions that had allowed communication between distant communities. Mississippi made teaching enslaved people to read punishable by death. These laws acknowledged what Turner had proven: knowledge was indeed power, and educated slaves represented an existential threat to the peculiar institution. The rebellion's impact extended beyond legislative chambers into the daily relationships that defined plantation life. White families who had trusted enslaved house servants for decades suddenly installed locks on bedroom doors and hired armed guards for protection during sleep. Children who had been raised by enslaved women now feared the same hands that had once comforted them. The intimate violence of slavery, previously hidden beneath paternalistic rhetoric, became visible to everyone involved. Northern abolitionists recognized Turner's rebellion as a watershed moment in the national debate over slavery. William Lloyd Garrison's The Liberator published extensive commentary on the uprising, arguing that violence was slavery's inevitable consequence rather than its aberrant exception. These arguments found receptive audiences among Northern whites who had previously viewed slavery as a distant Southern problem unrelated to their own moral obligations. From Frederick Douglass's later writings, Nat Turner's rebellion taught America that enslaved people were human beings capable of decisive action rather than docile property content with bondage. This recognition terrified slaveholders because it destroyed the philosophical foundations they used to justify their system. The execution's aftermath also exposed deep divisions within white Southern society. Poor whites who owned no enslaved people began questioning whether they should risk their lives defending a system that primarily benefited wealthy planters. Some argued that Turner's rebellion proved slavery was too dangerous to maintain, while others insisted that only more brutal repression could prevent future uprisings. Religious communities faced particularly difficult questions about Turner's theological justifications for violence. His careful use of biblical precedents had made it impossible to dismiss his actions as simple criminality divorced from Christian tradition. Southern ministers found themselves defending slavery against arguments drawn from the same scriptures they used to support their peculiar institution, creating theological contradictions that weakened their moral authority. Meanwhile, enslaved communities across the South absorbed lessons from Turner's rebellion that would influence resistance strategies for decades. The uprising had demonstrated both the possibilities and limitations of violent revolt, teaching future generations to calculate risks more carefully while maintaining hope for eventual liberation. Secret networks of communication that had supported Turner's rebellion survived his death, carrying information and inspiration across state lines. The rebellion's psychological impact proved more durable than its military achievements. White Southerners who had slept peacefully before August 1831 now barricaded their doors and listened nervously to night sounds that might herald another uprising. Every unexplained fire, every missing tool, every sullen look from an enslaved person carried potential threat that kept the rebellion's memory alive years after Turner's death. But perhaps Turner's greatest victory wasn't the terror he had planted in white minds. It was the proof he had provided that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, courage, and organizational capacity to challenge their oppression effectively. This knowledge couldn't be legislated away or suppressed through violence because it lived in the hearts and minds of everyone who had heard his story. The preacher warrior had accomplished something no previous rebel had achieved. He had forced America to confront the fundamental contradiction between its founding principles of human equality and its economic dependence on human bondage, creating a moral crisis that would ultimately require resolution through civil war. Blood had planted seeds of freedom that would grow in darkness until they finally bloomed 30 years later on battlefields where Turner's spirit marched with Union armies toward the final destruction of American slavery. The courthouse clock in Jerusalem struck midnight on December 31st, 1831, marking the end of a year that had shattered the American South's illusions about slavery forever. But in the darkness beyond the town square, something stirred that suggested Turner's rebellion had planted seeds that would bloom long after his body had returned to Virginia soil. The final reckoning of Turner's uprising revealed numbers that had been deliberately suppressed. During the initial investigations, over 100 enslaved people had died in the white retaliation that followed the rebellion, nearly double the number of whites killed during the uprising itself. This arithmetic of revenge exposed the brutal mathematics that had always governed American slavery, where black lives counted for nothing in the ledgers of white justice. State militias had executed suspected conspirators without trials across 5 counties, hanging bodies from trees that still bore strange fruit when spring arrived. Families who had owned these victims for decades participated in or silently witnessed murders that transformed neighbors into monsters overnight. The rebellion had revealed not just enslaved people's capacity for violence, but white society's willingness to abandon every principle of law and Christianity when their racial hierarchy faced challenge. Turner's theological arguments continued spreading through underground networks that carried his words far beyond Virginia's borders. Enslaved preachers across the South found copies of Gray's Confession hidden in their Bibles, passed hand to hand through communities that had learned to communicate in whispers and coded songs. The dead rebels' vision of divine judgment on American slavery became prophecy that inspired both hope and terror, depending on which side of the whip you occupied. The rebellion's impact on American politics proved more lasting than its military achievements. Northern congressmen began citing Turner's uprising as evidence that slavery threatened national stability, while Southern representatives demanded federal support for suppressing future rebellions. These debates established the framework for arguments that would eventually split the Union, making Turner's hatchet the first weapon fired in a war that wouldn't end until 1865. But perhaps the rebellion's most profound legacy lived in the minds of enslaved people who had witnessed proof that their oppressors could be challenged, defeated, and killed by ordinary men with extraordinary courage. This knowledge couldn't be legislated away or terrorized into submission because it represented truth more powerful than any law or punishment. White masters who thought Turner's execution had ended their nightmare discovered that dead martyrs cast longer shadows than living rebels. The psychological warfare Turner had initiated continued long after his death through unexplained incidents that kept white Southampton County in perpetual anxiety. Tools disappeared from locked sheds. Fires started in empty buildings. Overseers found their whips cut during the night. No evidence connected these incidents to organized conspiracy, but their timing and precision suggested Turner's influence persisted among followers who had learned his lessons about patience, planning, and striking when enemies least expected attack. From a private letter between Virginia planters, March 1832. The Negroes seemed different since Turner's rebellion, more watchful, more calculating. They work with same efficiency, but without the contentment we once believed genuine. We sleep less soundly knowing their compliance masks rather than reflects their true sentiments. Turner's greatest victory wasn't the terror he had planted in white minds or the hope he had kindled among enslaved people. It was the fundamental change he had forced in how Americans understood slavery itself. The comfortable fiction that human bondage rested on mutual benefit and divine sanction had died with his victims, replaced by open acknowledgement that the peculiar institution survived only through superior force, applied without mercy or restraint. This recognition transformed the national debate about slavery from abstract moral philosophy into urgent practical politics. Turner had proven that enslaved people possessed the intelligence, organization, and determination to challenge their oppression effectively, making gradual emancipation seem less like radical reform and more like practical necessity for national survival. The Preacher Warriors Rebellion had accomplished what decades of abolitionist arguments couldn't achieve. It had forced America to confront the violent reality underlying its economic prosperity and democratic ideals. Blood had been shed to plant seeds of freedom that would grow in darkness until they finally bloomed on Civil War battlefields, where Turner's spirit marched with Union armies toward slavery's final destruction. Freedom's roots ran red and deep. Turner's physical body had returned to Virginia earth, but his influence spread like underground rivers, feeding streams of resistance that would eventually become the flood that swept away American slavery forever. The rebellion that had seemed to end with 13 steps to a gallows had actually begun a longer march toward justice that wouldn't halt until every chain was broken and every slave was free. Even today, local residents near the old Turner Plantation claim they sometimes hear preaching voices carried on evening wind through tobacco fields where nothing grows anymore but weeds and memories. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.